the night the symptoms appeared. No one noticed because no one was looking in the right direction. The glass tower in downtown Chicago was lit like a jewel, hosting a charity summit packed with donors, executives, and cameras. And Richard Hale, the self-made millionaire CEO whose face was synonymous with success, stood at the center of it all, smiling through a tightening jaw and a strange, rhythmic pause in his breath that came and went like a faulty signal. He blamed the stiffness in his left wrist on stress, the faint dizziness on the long day, the way his words sometimes trailed off on the acoustics of the room, and everyone around him accepted those explanations because they needed him to be fine. Power has a way of demanding denial. Elijah Brooks, the janitor assigned to the executive floors, did not need Richard to be fine. Elijah needed the trash emptied, the floors clean, the night to pass without trouble so he could make it home in time to help his mother with her medication. He pushed his cart quietly past the ballroom doors, eyes lowered out of habit, until something made him stop. An interruption he felt more than saw. The pause. Elijah had seen that pause before, years ago, in his father's breath the night before the ambulance came too late. He watched Richard lift his champagne glass and miss his mouth by an inch, watched the CEO laugh it off as clumsiness while his left hand trembled, watched a sheen of sweat bead along his hairline despite the cool air. Elijah's heart thudded with a certainty he didn't want. He cleared his throat and spoke, soft but steady, telling the nearest aide that something was wrong, that the man needed to sit, needed help now. The aide smiled the way people smile at background noise and waved him away. "We've got it," she said, eyes already elsewhere. Elijah stood there, unseen, listening to the pause grow longer. When Richard finally stepped off the stage toward a private lounge, he leaned hard against the wall, the room spinning. He told himself he was tired, that this was what carrying a company felt like, that he'd power through like he always had. Elijah followed at a respectful distance, every instinct screaming, and when the CEO's knee buckled, Elijah caught him before his head struck marble. The aide gasped. Phones came out. Someone laughed nervously and said it was probably dehydration. Elijah knelt, guiding Richard down, speaking to him, asking him to squeeze his fingers, to smile. The smile tilted wrong. Elijah didn't hesitate. He called out for 911, demanded an AED, told them to note the time, to keep Richard still. The aide bristled at his tone until she saw Richard's eyes glaze and the color drain from his face. The room erupted into motion too late and all at once, but Elijah anchored the chaos, counting breaths, watching the chest, remembering the pamphlets he'd studied after his father's stroke. How denial had stolen minutes that night. How minutes were everything. When the paramedics arrived, they listened because the facts were undeniable now, because the janitor had already done the work of attention. Richard seized on the gurney, then went still, and Elijah kept counting until a medic told him to stop. Hours later, dawn crept across the city, and the headlines wrote themselves wrong. They called it a sudden medical emergency, a scare, a reminder to hydrate. They did not mention the pause. In the ICU, machines hummed while doctors spoke in careful sentences about transient ischemic attacks, about a clot that could have finished the job if it had traveled a little farther, about how fast response had saved a life. Richard woke to those sentences and felt a different kind of mention the pause. In the ICU, machines hummed while doctors spoke in careful sentences about transient ischemic attacks, about a clot that could have finished the job if it had traveled a little farther, about how fast response had saved a life. Richard woke to those sentences and felt a different kind of fear, the kind that comes when your myth cracks. He asked who had been there first. The nurse told him a janitor named Elijah. Richard stared at the ceiling, replaying the night, the way he'd been seen without being known, and something shifted. The company sent a gift basket to Elijah's supervisor. Security thanked him. The aide apologized. Life tried to slide back into its grooves. Elijah scrubbed a stain near the elevators and thought about his father, about the sound of the ambulance doors, about how seeing had not been enough back then because no one had listened. He didn't expect anything else. When he was called to the executive suite 2 days later, he assumed it was a formality, maybe a photo. Richard sat pale but upright, a brace on his wrist, humility heavy in the room. He didn't offer a speech. He asked Elijah to tell him exactly what he'd seen and why he'd known. Elijah spoke about pauses and tremors and denial, about how people are trained not to look at those they don't need. Richard listened like a man learning a new language. The twist came quietly, the way real change does. Richard canceled his next appearance and ordered a company-wide health training, not as a PR move but as policy. and insisted Elijah help design it. When the board balked, Richard told them the truth, that leadership meant being interruptible, that survival sometimes arrived on a janitor's cart. He paid for Elijah's EMT certification. He funded a clinic in the neighborhood Elijah came from. He stood on a stage months later and told a room full of donors that the most valuable asset in any building was attention, and that it had nearly cost him his life. Elijah did not become a celebrity. He became what he had always been, a man who noticed. And somewhere between the pauses and the listening, a millionaire learned that being saved is not the same as being important, and that the people we ignore are often the ones holding the time we think we own.